A naked man jumps on the high altar in St. Peter's Basilica. And what does the Vatican do? With us, Church Militant's Rome correspondent, Dr. Jules Gomes. Jules, tell us more about this sacrilege.
Brad, on Thursday afternoon, just as the Basilica was about to close, a 34-year-old Polish man rushed to the high altar, the altar of the confession, jumped on the mob, stripped naked, totally stark naked. On his back, there was written, "Save Children of Ukraine." He jumped on the marble surface directly above the holy relics of St. Peter's bones, St. Peter's tomb, the holiest location in Christendom. And he began shouting pro-Ukraine slogans from the top of the altar.
Well, I can understand his concern for the Ukraine especially, but did anyone try to stop him in this sacrilegious act?
The Vatican police and the gendarmerie rushed up and they apprehended him. They asked him to put on his clothes. They took him away, identified him, and he was then deported. But what we now know from the blog Sacrilege non possum, the blog that broke the story, they say that Cardinal Mauro Gambetti, who is the archpriest in charge of St. Peter's Basilica, they accuse him of a lot of things, including nepotism, getting family members plum jobs at the Basilica. And they say he's put into effect cost-cutting measures. And as a result of that, security at the Basilica has dropped. Now, this is not the first time such an incident has happened. And Sacrilege non possum are warning that this is what we told you would happen under the administration of Cardinal Mauro Gambetti.
This isn't just any altar that this happened to. Tell us a bit more about this particular altar.
Brad, this is called the altar of confession. This is the main altar in St. Peter's. This is, as I said, the holiest site in the Catholic Church. It's the altar where only the Pope is allowed to celebrate the Eucharist, unless, of course, he delegates this to someone else. It took Gian Lorenzo Bernini, this great architect who designed the altar, the baldacchino above it, those wonderful arms around St. Peter's Basilica in the piazza. It took him 11 years to design and build this altar, and to see it desecrated in such a sacrilegious manner is not only heartbreaking, but it is shocking to the faithful.
And to have it right over the tomb of St. Peter's and his own relics there is amazing. This is so clearly an act of desecration and profanation. Did the Vatican reconsecrate the altar and also the Basilica?
Now, that's a very good question, and there's a lot of heated debate over this at the moment, because Canon 1211 says that if there is an act that may be viewed as profanation, and it can be seen as an act of profanation, this canon says, if it causes scandal to the faithful. In that case, the ordinary of the diocese should discern, and if he discerns that this is indeed the case, he should have a penitential rite conducted there. Now, this is, of course, the new code of canon law, and following this, on Saturday noon, Cardinal Mauro Gambetti and the canons of the chapter of St. Peter's came together, held a service of penitence. Very interestingly, there was no exorcism, there was no reconsecration, there was no admitting, in a sense, that this was explicitly an act of profanation. Instead, Cardinal Gambetti, in his sermon and in the liturgy, asked for the forgiveness of the sin. It looks like we've all committed that sin. And the structures of sin. Remember that old term from liberation theology? Let me quote what the Cardinal said in his sermon. He said, it is this structures of sin that causes a person who perhaps does not feel heard, who wants to draw attention to the world's poverty, such as the children of Ukraine, which drives a person to perhaps be listened to in making a gesture, however inappropriate, truly unpleasant, as happened here at St. Peter's on Thursday. So the Cardinal was, in a sense, almost implicating all of us and saying that, it's no big deal.
Wow, talk about watering it down. You mentioned, Jules, an exorcism being involved in the reconsecration. Could you explain that angle to our viewers?
I was talking to a historian who is an expert on the Basilica and on the papacy. He lives in Rome, but he has asked us not to reveal his name because he is, he works in a high-profile position. Now, he pointed to me with evidence how in the 1940s there were 2 suicides in St. Peter's Basilica. A couple of people, including an Italian barber, shot themselves, and the Basilica was reconsecrated. But again, in 1979, there was a suicide. We don't know exactly what happened after that. But in 1999, after Vatican II, when another suicide took place, this time the Basilica was not reconsecrated, but there was an act of penance taking place. Mind you, what Gambezi did on Saturday did involve the sprinkling of holy water on the altar and incensing the altar and all that sort of thing. But the historian also told me that in the sack of Rome, May 1527, where 300 of the Swiss Guard were attacked by raiders, there were only 24 left alive. And the cathedral, St. Peter's Basilica, was filled with blood and gore. Pope Clement VII did reconsecrate it. And as we do at baptism, at least in the traditional rite of baptism, we do have an act of exorcism. So the historian said there ought to be an act of exorcism, liturgically speaking, in the reconsecration of a sacred building like this, particularly when such an act of desecration has taken place.
Now, also some observers are saying this altar was already previously desecrated at the Pachamama worship during the infamous Amazonian Synod in Rome in 2019. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And one of those who has commented quite incisively on this is the famous Vaticanist Dr. Robert Moynihan, where he talks about how in October 2019, the plants that were offered to Pachamama in some sort of an occultic ritual, these are his words, involving, he says there was some red color there, which is very significant in terms of this kind of pagan rite. This bowl of plants, this pot of plants, was kept on the altar. And what people say is that the altar is obviously the place where the Mass, the sacrifice of the Mass is offered. And you do not keep extraneous items that are not liturgically pertinent to the offering of the Holy Eucharist. But this was done. And people have also said, Armin Schweibach, I think, Swiss German commentator, he talks about how for months after this, Pachamama thing took place on the altar, and you remember COVID struck sometime after that, the altar was just left bare by Pope Francis and not used for months together. Masses were said at side altars, but this main altar, the altar of the confession, virtually commemorating the martyrdom of St. Peter, was not used, Brad.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Jules. Liturgically, you don't just put pots of flowers all over the altar, and especially ones that were consecrated or offered to some idol. Finally here, we have this sacrilegious protest comes just 3 weeks after Pope Francis welcomed Ukraine President Zelensky in the Vatican. Can you connect those dots for us?
There doesn't seem to be a direct connection between, what happened on Thursday and Zelensky's visit. But we did talk about it in a Rome dispatch, how Zelensky tried to spin the meeting in his favor and how he just wanted to have his own way rather than talk about, listen to that big word again, listening. It didn't seem to want to listen to Pope Francis and mediate in any meaningful manner. But what police are saying is that this man who jumped on the altar was mentally unstable. I mean, this is the kind of thing they say about jihadis as well, don't they? We really don't know if he was an activist, if he was anti-Catholic, if he was mentally unstable. But again, it does look very clearly like he was a fanatic in terms of the Ukraine cause. And that is why he committed this sacrilegious act.
Regardless of anyone's views on the war plaguing Ukraine and all the terrible fallout from that, some forms of protest are just simply wrong. And committing sacrilege on God's altar is not a way to gain his blessing. Thanks, Jules, for following up on this developing story.
Thank you, Brad.